In this video, we bring you two truly terrifying horror stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. If you've experienced any true horror, share your chilling stories with me. Follow me on Instagram, link in description, and first comment, DM me your terrifying incident. I'll upload next video. Don't forget to subscribe, Whispering Walls. Let's dive into our video. They say the quietest towns hold the darkest secrets. Crescent Lake, Minnesota, seemed like the safest place to work the night shift until James Peterson's encounter with Unit 47B. What started as a routine patrol became a night he'd never forget, and one he'd never talk about again. Crescent Lake, Minnesota, is the kind of town where life moves quietly. A town where the most exciting thing to happen might be a bake sale or a new bench at the park. James Peterson, a 34-year-old father of two, had taken the job as a security guard at the Crescent Lake storage facility for that very reason: peace and quiet. The job was simple: patrol the rows of units, watch the monitors, and make sure no one tried to sneak in. Nothing exciting ever happened. But that night, November 15th, 2019, something changed. James arrived at 10 p.m., greeted by the usual stillness of the snow-covered lot. After a quick walkthrough, he settled into the small office with his thermos of coffee and flipped on the monitors. The screen showed rows of silent units, each one identical, stretching into the darkness. Everything was fine until it wasn't. Just after midnight, James noticed something on the screen. The door to Unit 47B, which was supposed to be empty, was slightly ajar. He frowned. He knew for a fact that unit had been locked earlier that day. He double-checked the logs. No one had rented it. A single chair sat in the middle of the unit, and on it was an old cassette recorder. James stepped inside, his breath visible in the freezing air. The recorder looked like it had been there for years, dusty, worn. He hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. He pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then faint whispers began to emerge, growing louder and clearer. The voices weren't speaking English. They sounded ancient, like a chant. James's chest tightened as the whispers seemed to grow closer, more insistent. He hit stop and set the recorder back down. As he turned to leave, he noticed something else: footprints. Bare, human footprints leading from the chair to the doorway. Fresh footprints pressed into the dust. James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He backed out of the unit, pulling the door shut behind him. But just as he latched it, he heard something, a faint laugh. It wasn't coming from the unit, it was coming from behind him. He spun around, shining his flashlight, but the lot was empty. Shaking, he radioed his supervisor, but before he could get a response, the radio crackled to life. "James," a voice said. James froze. It wasn't his supervisor's voice. It wasn't any voice he recognized. The sound was low, distorted, almost wet. "James," it repeated. "Come back to 47B." He dropped the radio and ran back to the office. Inside, he locked the door and checked the monitors. The screen for 47B flickered with static before going black. Then, the lights in the office flickered. James stared at the monitors, heart racing. The power cut out completely, plunging him into darkness. For a moment, all he could hear was his own breathing. Then a sound broke the silence. A faint tapping on the office door. James didn't move. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, turning into a knock. And then, silence. The power flickered back on. The monitors lit up. James's eyes shot to the screen for 47B. The door was open again. Inside, the chair was gone. James was gone, and the door came open again. Inside, James was commanded to move. It had to bide. There was no time for more words. But in its place, something else sat in the center of the unit. It was a box. The monitor glitched, and when the image came back, the box was open. James didn't wait to see what was inside. He grabbed his keys and bolted to his car. Snow flew as he peeled out of the lot, leaving the facility behind. The next morning, he quit his job. He didn't explain why, and he didn't care. Crescent Lake Storage Facility eventually rented out 47B to a new tenant. But they didn't stay long. They reported strange sounds, whispers, tapping, and the faint sound of a cassette tape playing. James has never spoken about what happened that night. He avoids that part of town completely. But those who know the story say one thing: if you ever rent Unit 47B, don't go there alone. And if you hear your name, don't answer. The Whispering Shadows. It was a frigid November evening when Emma, a young journalist, pulled up to the long-abandoned Prescott Manor. Nestled at the edge of town, the mansion had stood desolate for over a decade, its windows dark, its stone facade slowly crumbling under the weight of neglect. Local legend spoke of eerie happenings within its walls, whispers in the night, shadowy figures that vanished when looked at directly, and stories of the last owner, Charles Prescott, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Emma, always skeptical of ghost stories, had been assigned to write an article on the manor's chilling history, but she had no idea just how real those stories were. The moment she stepped across the threshold, an unsettling weight pressed down on her chest. The grand entrance hall, once filled with light and life, now stood dark, suffocating. Every step she took seemed to echo in the empty house, reverberating with a strange, unnatural resonance. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air, and she shivered, though her coat was thick. Shaking off the sudden unease, Emma began snapping photos of the decaying grandeur, more focused on her assignment than the growing feeling that something was wrong. The grand staircase twisted upward like a dark, broken spine, its steps covered in dust and debris. Faded portraits of long-dead Prescott ancestors stared down at her, their eyes dark and lifeless. She couldn't help but feel as though they were watching her, waiting for something. She moved deeper into the house, the floorboards groaning under her weight as she ventured into what had once been the library. Thick layers of dust blanketed the room, and the walls were lined with towering shelves, the edges of books curling and rotting with time. The air smelled of mildew and old paper, but as Emma moved closer to a desk in the corner, something on the floor caught her eye. A worn leather journal half buried under a pile of yellowed papers. Her curiosity piqued, she bent down and carefully opened it. The journal belonged to Charles Prescott, the manor's last occupant. At first, Emma skimmed through the pages, disjointed thoughts about his declining health, his waning fortune, and cryptic mentions of the strange occurrences in the house. But then, one entry made her freeze. The whispers won't stop. They come from the walls, the floors, the very foundation of this house. I hear them at night, low voices murmuring my name. It's not my mind playing tricks. Something is here, something ancient. I can feel its presence, crawling inside the walls in the corners of my vision. I hear them, always. Emma, they are waiting for you. Emma's pulse quickened. She looked around, her skin prickling with an unseen dread. The whispers. Had they come from the journal? She shook her head, trying to brush off the feeling, but the air in the room had thickened. A sense of pressure began to mount. The silence became almost unbearable. Her breath hitched. She thought she heard something soft, distant, almost imperceptible, like a whisper coming from the hallway outside. Emma? The voice was quiet, but unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked around the room, the shadows growing deeper in the corners of the room as her flashlight flickered. She was alone, wasn't she? Who's there? She called, her voice trembling. No answer. The silence swallowed her whole. But then, again, Emma. It came from behind her, faint but undeniably real. A cold draft brushed against her neck, sending a shiver down her spine. The air turned icy, almost suffocating, and she spun around, desperate to find the source. Nothing. Her breath came in shallow gasps. "Stay calm," she told herself. She was a journalist, a skeptic. There had to be an explanation. But the walls felt wrong. The shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting like something alive. Then, from the corner of her eye, something shifted. A shape. Just at the edge of her vision. She turned sharply, her heart racing. A pale woman stood in the doorway of the study, her hair dark and disheveled, her skin ashen, her eyes hollow, sunken and black as midnight. The walls felt wrong. Something stood in the doorway of the study. Emma's voice caught in her throat. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her mouth, swallowed by the oppressive silence that had overtaken the house. The woman took a step forward, her lips parting. "You shouldn't have come here." Emma stumbled backward, her pulse hammering in her ears. Her mind raced, fighting against the terror gripping her heart. "Who are you?" she managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. The woman didn't answer. She only pointed toward the end of the hall. Emma's eyes followed the direction of the gesture. At the far end, a door stood ajar, one she hadn't noticed before, its edges glowing faintly as though beckoning her closer. The whispering voices grew louder now, swirling around her, desperate, frantic. "Don't listen," the woman hissed, her voice barely a breath, but Emma couldn't resist. The pull toward the door was overwhelming. She walked forward, her feet almost moving of their own accord, and reached for the cold doorknob. The moment her hand touched it, the entire house seemed to groan, a deep, resonating sound that vibrated through the very bones of the manor. The air became thick with a presence that pressed in on her from all sides. The door creaked open. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. The room was pitch black, save for strange, faint symbols glowing along the walls. They twisted and shifted, like something alive. As Emma stepped inside, the air turned frigid. Her breath misted in front of her, but the cold wasn't just from the temperature. It was something else, something ancient, something suffocating. The voices in her head screamed now, not in whispers, but in frantic urgency. "Come closer, come to us. Welcome home, Emma." Her legs buckled beneath her, and she fell to her knees, paralyzed by fear. Her head spun as the room seemed to stretch, its walls closing in on her. The shadows gathered around her, pressing in on all sides. She could hear the voices clearly now, a chorus of lost souls, whispering her name, pulling her deeper into the darkness. In the center of the room, a shape appeared, its form indistinct at first, but then Charles Prescott. His hollow eyes stared into hers, his face twisted in a grimace of pain. He reached out a trembling hand, his voice a rasping whisper. "They are in the walls, and they are waiting for you." Suddenly the room was flooded with a deafening noise, the whispers and shadows converging in a frenzy. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating her. Emma's last breath caught in her throat as her world turned to darkness. Days later, a search party found the manor empty. The only trace of Emma was her journalistic equipment, her camera lying shattered on the floor of the study, the battery dead. But no sign of her, no clue to where she had gone. In her abandoned notebook, her last entry was found, hastily scribbled. "They are in the walls, and they are waiting. I can hear them calling my name." The manor stood silent, its secrets hidden within its decaying walls. Subscribe our channel Whispering Walls for more heart-pumping video. Like, share, and support. Thanks for watching.